All we need is the zip, fabric, Silecia, and linen. Some zip options are linked, but material pour la trousers should be uploaded, so I won't go into depth about the type of zip, but you can see it's a curved zip of not important but generically long length, preferably. Start with a long vertical line parallel with the grain at least 20 cm tall. Mark the top and bottom points 20 cm apart. Make a horizontal line at the lower point, measure half a centimetre out from the original and join that up to the top 20 cm point up the first line. Measure 7 cm along the horizontal line from the first line and join this to the second line in an even curve. From the same point on the horizontal line, make a curved line back towards the pattern. This would be the inside leg. We don't need much, so just go down 5 to 10 centimeters and square it off. Square off at the top point of our first line and close the box somewhere, joining it to our bottom line. Along the top, add 3 centimeters of inlay. Final bit, the crotch notch. Make a 45-degree line from the point that the slightly diagonal line meets the horizontal one. Halfway between there and where that line hits the curve and where the curve hits the diagonal line, make a notch. Cut this piece out, and you might like to either mark stitch or, better, snip into the fabric, literally less than half a centimeter to mark the notch onto both pieces. But mark stitch the inlay at the top of the two pieces. We want to mark stitch close to the center front, but still about 1 centimeter away for the seam. Then whatever amount going back along that line. We need the trouser piece to make the fly and fly guard, or bearer as it's often known. Line the trouser pieces onto the fabric following the same grain still doubled up fabric. It's best if we lay it on as we cut it with the same side facing upwards, because the guard and the fly need to be cut to the correct sides. With this method, doing it this way, I don't need to think very much about it, since that's what I always do. Unless I were doing a woman's pair of trews. Copy off the top, the curved edge, the notch and the inlay. Inlay matters less though. What's important to get right is the notch. Remove the trouser and start a few centimeters down along the curve from the notch, 3 to 5 centimeters. Make a line out from there, not quite perpendicular. Measure 5 centimeters and 6 centimeters along that line. Along the straight, measure from there 6 centimeters straight down. Split that into 2 lines, joining one to the 5 centimeter line and one to the 6 centimeter point from a second ago. From the second line, we can draw out another 6 centimeters, and from the inlay, 6 centimeters down as well. Make those square and curve the corners into the first piece we drew. Cut those out on doubled up fabric, marking the notch one way or the other, or both, not bothering with the inlay. To make the fly, cut off the small section at the bottom of the curve and the extension along the straight diagonal line from earlier. Mark the wrong side on both. You also need a piece of material cut on the bias for the fly. With my measurements, it'll be about 27 centimeters long and it's usually 3 or 4 centimeters wide. It's the length of the curve on your fly plus about 6 centimeters. You can cut this out of Silecia or your chosen lining material. You also need a rectangular piece, or more abstract shaped piece, which more than fully eclipses the fly guard. Both the bearer and fly need a backing of either linen or fusing. Lay both pieces on a sheet of linen and cut around both pieces. Same for fusing, except we're not fusing, are we? Place the linen onto the wrong side of its appropriate piece. We'll sew them together along the notch side with the more gentle curve, and we're just sewing with a less than ½ centimeter seam allowance, sewing linen side up both times. To prepare the fly, place the bias cut Silecia onto the longer side of the fly, the side without the notch, with a few centimeters above and below the top and bottom of the fly. Machine the bias tape to the fly with a ½ centimeter seam allowance on the right side, as in correct side that faces up. Fold the bias material over and iron it, which is why it's cut on the bias. It'll shrink and stretch and sit neatly as we iron it in place. Then we'll sink stitch it, which is simply stitching right at the point that the bias and the fly meet. For the guard, lay the eclipsing fabric onto the right side and stitch with a 1 centimeter seam allowance on the curve, which goes into the extruded rectangle and right up there. Cut away the excess on the outside, only leaving most of the excess seeping out from the non-sewn edges, which I did off screen because I forgot to hit record. We'll need the cloth extending from the unsewn edges later on. Cut a few chevrons at the convex curves and cut a few notches at the concave curve. And we're going to flip it inside out and iron it such that a little bit of the main material is showing on the offside. We'll flip these out now. This is called bagging. and it needs a new name, but that is its current recognized designation. I suggest, with the Silecia side up, ironing the stitch line slightly over onto the Silecia side. The left or right leg is as we lay them correct side up and pointing towards each other, with the inlay towards us. It's the right leg as we'd wear them. So, in that case, the one on the right. Obviously, if the inlay was facing away, the left leg would be on the right because, well, that's the left leg, right? Baste the zip down, fastening it from the notch. We also need the bottom stop of the zip to be as much as 3mm above the notch. We might also like to chalk the notch out so that we can see it on the other side of the zip. Then, lining the fly guard, right side to right side, moving the Silecia out of the way. You could baste this too, or you could just machine it. Use a 1/2 centimeter seam allowance. A zip foot would come into its own, but as it stands, I can just move the slider out of the way. Except I have a long enough zip so it's not even bothering me. You can remove the basting now, and you just need to fold the guard out. You're going to push the trouser over the zip tape until it's a few millimeters from the teeth, and then you'll baste it there. Now, cut the notch across to where the fold is, and you can unfold that over the zip tape. Align the fly and its notch to the trouser piece and its notch. Sew from the notch again, and with the linen side up. Stitch with a small centimeter seam allowance, being 7 or 8mm ideally. This will become 1 whole centimeter when we fold the fly into the trouser and fold a little more of the trouser towards the inside. Cut the notch through both pieces right to the stitching, proceeding to cut away about half the fly seam. This will make the seam sit flatter. Iron the seams over onto the fly and then fold the fly onto the trouser, making sure that there is about 1mm of the front edging over, such that the seam isn't at all visible from the front. And then we'll baste it down along the edge. Line up the bottom curved seams with the left leg on top, so the fly side. Line up the notches and the seam. However, because we want the fly side to slightly overbear the guard side, we might want to change exactly where the seam is lined up, moving where we cut down our notch slightly further away from the seam than it might ordinarily sit if necessary. Baste these two together about 1 centimetre from the seam that we're going to follow. We're going to machine the curve and or fork or seat line. Start right at the notch at the point that we cut down to on the fly. Keep the fly piece and the zip and bearer and all that out of the way. It's only the two legs being sewn together. Send the needle into the point of the notch, exactly down where we cut to. Make a few stitches and back tack directly back onto the notch. Then continuing onwards, adopting the 1 centimetre seam allowance for the remainder of the seam. Press the seam flat first, then ironing the seam open. Easiest over an edge board because the legs can hang over either side, while the seam can lay partially flat. Always using some steam and leaving the iron there to dry it out. You'll now decide how you want the trouser to sit. There is an overlap at the bottom, and you want to increase that overlap as you get to the top of the zip. Usually we've decided the overlap when we put the waistband on. I'll just say 7mm from the forward edge of the fabric, and I'll chalk that there. Line the fly side onto the guard side, lining the top to the 7mm point on the fly side, and making sure there is overlap at the bottom. We basically just don't want to see the zip. We need to baste it quite securely for about 30 seconds. Flip the trouser over and the currently loose side of the zip will be sitting pretty on the fly. Do it up. Baste that in place, though only the fly and the zip tape, and the bias tape if applicable, because we want to get behind it still. Fill the edge of the tape to the fly from the bottom. This is different when it's on a trouser, because we might have sewn the fly down with the waistband, fixing it down with the waistline horizontally across the top. But it's not that so much different. Keep going until the top of the zip tape, or a bit less than halfway up the inlay. About halfway between the edge of the tape and the teeth, prick stitch it. Again, stitch all the way up. You can remove the basting. From here we need to secure the fly to the front trouser, keeping the guard out of the way, and from the front we'll baste them together. For best results, we'd lay it on a tailor's ham to simulate the shape of the crotch. Regardless of that though, we need them to be flat together. As we sew, we need to make sure that neither is pulling on the other. So all the way down, following the curve of the fly and just fastening the base to the bottom. The Silecia on the guard needs to be folded away. On the bottom half of the fly guard, fold its lining over such that it's still covering the seam connecting the front trouser and fly guard. I chalked on the seam and cut away the excess with the seam allowance. As we get to the curve at the bottom of the bearer fly guard, we might need to cut away some of the Silecia, making sure we still have enough to fold back. Snip into the seam, making it easier to fold in the curve. We don't really want to extend too much further down the seam, but enough to cover it, maybe no more than 5mm. We're only sewing the bottom half of it down because we need to get the curtain from the waistband video under there. Below the fly and fly guard, where the bottoms meet, there should still be an excess of Silecia extending beyond them. The excess lining will be folded together and secured behind the fly, all neat-like. Fold and iron the Silecia that extends beyond the fly and bearer together. Then cut away the excess Silecia slightly beyond where the fly and bearer ends to the effect of being able to fold them underneath the fly. Baste it down and make sure it looks alright. The beginning of the ending is the J-stitch, which is present on practically all trousers. Mark a line down parallel to the overbearing trouser, and the stitch usually begins 3.5 centimeters across at the top. It goes right down and curves in. Start at the top on the inside and fasten the thread. Go to the outside and follow the chalk line with a prick stitch, only catching the fly. At the base, Sew a bar tack. You could sew it vertically, horizontally, over both pieces of cloth or just the overbearing one. To each your own. I might venture that it should be made as unobtrusively as convenient, while still being fully functional. But I defer to you, and you ought to defer to whomever you may be making trousers for. Now we'll prick stitch the cloth next to the zip on the underside, the guard side, in place. Start at the top on the inside to fasten the thread discreetly, moving out to the front to just prick stitch the fabric along the edge to the zip tape. We can secure the end at the bottom of the zip tape or anywhere else that'll be discreet. In a similar way, sew down the front edge of the fly to replace the line of basting there, securing the thread on the inside at the top. Secure the thread as out of the way as possible at the bottom. Near the bottom, the fly and fly guard needs to be tacked together. I'd just say level with the bottom stop. We need to fix the Silecia that we folded and basted up behind the fly and fly guard. Use a blanket stitch or cross stitch, I'd suggest. Stitch through as much as you like, but don't let it show through the front. Once that's secure, without bothering to start a new stitch, we can prick stitch up the edge of the guard silecia to the seam allowance that we basted. Again, we don't need to go up all the way, but usually we'd progress straight to filling the curtain to the guard. Though we could also just fill the silecia to the lining if we had one.